The Boeing 737 hummed like a giant silver beast cutting through the sky at 35,000 feet. Outside, the sun glinted off the wingtip as clouds drifted lazily below, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold. Passengers, lulled by the steady drone of the engines, leaned back in their seats. Some closed their eyes, trying to nap. Others scrolled endlessly through social media feeds, the glow of their screens reflecting on anxious faces. Flight attendants moved with quiet, choreographed precision, balancing trays, offering snacks, and exchanging polite smiles. It was a routine flight from Chicago to Denver, or at least it seemed so. In seat 12B, Jessica Rivera shifted in her window seat. She was a nurse, returning from a medical conference in Boston, exhausted but trying to savor a few hours of peace before reaching home. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her scrubs, ironically more comfortable than casual clothes, creased as she bent over a magazine she wasn't reading. Her mind wasn't on the travel tips or medical updates in the pages before her. It was still caught in the whirlwind of the past week. Endless shifts, fluorescent lights, and the faint but constant hum of hospital anxiety had followed her here, and for a moment, the gentle vibration of the aircraft against her legs felt like a lullaby. Then a cough, sharp, unmistakable. Jessica froze, instinctively looking up. It wasn't in the cabin, it came over the intercom. The voice of Captain Reynolds, calm and authoritative just moments ago, sputtered, then stopped. There was a pause so long that the gentle clinking of beverage carts seemed deafening. "Captain Reynolds." The co-pilot's voice was tight, almost brittle over the intercom. The murmurs began immediately in the cabin. A man in 7C gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened. A woman nearby whispered to her husband, "What's wrong?" The pilot's voice should have been steady, but it was. Jessica's pulse spiked. Her training, honed through years of high-stress emergency rooms and rushed ICU shifts, kicked in instantly. She had seen patients go from breathing calmly to lifeless in seconds, and the weight of that knowledge settled in her chest. She rose, ignoring the curious stares of fellow passengers, weaving past the narrow aisles of the cabin. Her nurse's bag, stuffed with brochures and a half-empty water bottle, bounced against her hip as she moved, but she barely noticed. The cockpit door loomed ahead, slightly ajar. The co-pilot's hands were shaking as he fumbled with the controls, his eyes darting nervously between instruments, and the captain slumped forward. Jessica could see Captain Reynolds' chest barely moving, a shallow rise and fall that was inconsistent, almost imperceptible. The captain's lips were gray, his hands loose on the yoke. Jessica's mind raced. She had to act, and fast. Every second at 35,000 feet was amplified, stretched impossibly long, a heartbeat away from catastrophe. She knelt beside the captain and checked for a pulse at his neck. Weak. Erratic. Her hands moved with precision, tilting his head, opening the airway, brushing back a lock of gray hair plastered to his forehead. "Get oxygen now," she barked to the co-pilot, her voice cutting through the cockpit's tense hum. The co-pilot nodded, fumbling to pull the emergency oxygen masks over the captain. Alarms began beeping in rapid succession, a shrill, insistent cry that seemed to echo inside Jessica's skull. Passengers could hear the change in tone now, the quiet panic that had begun in the cockpit spilling into the cabin. Jessica glanced over her shoulder. The people she passed were wide-eyed, frozen somewhere between fascination and fear. Children clung to parents, strangers whispered prayers, and a man's trembling hands gripped a window frame like it could hold him steady. The nurse's heart ached for them, but she pushed it down, focusing entirely on the living, breathing urgency before her. Her fingers pressed against the captain's pulse point again, weak, fading like a candle threatened by a sudden gust of wind. She leaned closer, whispering encouragement, though she knew he couldn't hear. "Stay with me, come on." The plane shuddered slightly as it hit a pocket of turbulence. Passengers yelped, cups rattled in trays, and luggage shifted in the overhead bins. Jessica's hands remained on the captain's chest. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to anchor her body, grounding herself so every movement was deliberate, precise. Then came another sound over the intercom, the co-pilot's strained, shaky voice. "Mayday, mayday," requesting immediate assistance. "Captain unresponsive, requesting medical advice." Jessica's stomach dropped. She had stabilized patients in ICU rooms on gurneys under fluorescent lights. This was different. The stakes weren't just one life, they were hundreds. One wrong move here could send the plane plummeting into mountains or open plains. She could feel the weight of the aircraft, the hum of the engines vibrating through the cockpit floorboards, pressing against her chest, making her question for a split second whether she could actually save him. A flight attendant poked her head into the cockpit, eyes wide, voice trembling. Do you need help?" Jessica didn't answer. She barely had time to breathe. Every second felt stretched, surreal. She had to focus. She checked the captain again, this time pressing for more response, tilting his head, scanning for signs of consciousness. Then a faint flutter. Not enough, but it was something. Her hands shook despite the adrenaline, and her jaw clenched as she whispered again, "Hold on, just hold on." Behind her, the passengers in the cabin were shifting in uneasy murmurs. Some were recording the scene with phones, others were silently praying. The tension was so thick it could be sliced with a knife. Each second that passed without full recovery brought a new spike of fear. Jessica's eyes flicked to the co-pilot, whose pale face betrayed the panic he was trying to suppress. The autopilot was still engaged, but barely. The instruments blinked ominously. She realized in a terrifying instant that stabilizing the captain wasn't enough. The plane needed someone at the controls, someone who could make life-or-death decisions in the span of heartbeats. And she, Jessica Rivera, had only her wits, her training, and sheer will. The faint pulse under her fingers faltered again. The cockpit lights reflected off her sweating face. Outside, the sky was perfect, serene, a cruel contrast to the chaos inside. Somewhere behind her, the murmur of passengers had grown louder. A child whimpered softly. The engines hummed steadily, but Jessica knew it wouldn't last if the captain didn't recover. Her heart hammered. She realized the terrifying truth. This flight, routine just minutes ago, had become a high-stakes gamble between life and death, and the outcome rested on her next move. She inhaled sharply, bracing herself. And then the captain's body slumped further, unresponsive, leaving Jessica staring into a void of uncertainty. Jessica's heart slammed against her ribcage like a warning bell. The captain's body was still, limp against the controls. Panic hovered in the cockpit like a living thing, coiling around every instrument, every panel, every passenger somewhere far below, unaware of how close they were to disaster. She pressed her hands firmly against his chest, counting compressions in her head. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm clashing with the hum of the engines. She could feel the vibration through her fingertips, and for a moment she imagined herself suspended between life and death, the plane a fragile bubble in a sky that offered no mercy. "Call emergency services. Get them on the radio now," she barked, voice hoarse but commanding. The co-pilot fumbled with the headset, pale and shaking. His fingers were trembling as he pressed buttons he hadn't fully understood in training. Sweat streaked his forehead, his lips quivering. "Mayday, mayday," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper as static crackled through the intercom. Jessica ignored him, focusing entirely on the captain. She tilted his head back, checking for an airway obstruction, and blew a slow, deliberate breath into his mouth. The chest rose minutely, a fraction too weak to count as stable. Her hands slammed back down in chest compressions, the rhythm cutting through the deafening roar of her thoughts. Each second stretched impossibly long. She imagined the passengers below, some texting frantically, some clinging to loved ones, all unaware how close they were to catastrophe. The plane was moving, yet still, held in that suspended terror of the unknown. Outside, the sky was deceptively calm. Sunlight slanted through the cockpit window, glinting off the dashboard, the reflection catching Jessica's eyes like a warning. She gritted her teeth, refusing to blink, unwilling to let even a single second slip by. Then, without warning, the aircraft shuddered violently, a sharp dip caused by turbulence that seemed to twist reality itself. Jessica's knees buckled slightly as she held onto the captain, trying not to fall, trying to stay in control. "Pressure check," she barked at the co-pilot, pointing to the gauges. He froze, staring at the blinking dials as though the numbers could magically give him guidance. "Check the engine output, altitude, speed," she continued, her voice rising. Her commands were steady, unyielding, but inside, her mind was a storm. She realized with a cold clarity that she was the only adult fully aware of what was happening. Every other person in the cockpit was scrambling. Every passenger below was oblivious. Every life on this plane now rested on her ability to act, and act perfectly. She pressed her ear to the captain's chest again. The pulse was there, faint, sporadic, as though the aircraft itself was draining him dry. Her stomach clenched with fear. If she failed, there would be no second chance. She inhaled sharply, steeling herself. "I need you to stay with me, Reynolds," she whispered, voice low but desperate. "I can't do this without you." The co-pilot's hand shook violently as he adjusted a dial. "The autopilot, it's failing," he admitted. Panic laced his words. "We can't keep this altitude." Jessica froze. The autopilot is failing. Every horror scenario she had ever imagined in training or in movies flooded her mind. The plane could descend uncontrollably, hit turbulence, crash into a mountain range, or worse, the vast emptiness of open land giving no one a chance to survive. She swallowed, heart hammering. Her hands were shaking now, but she forced herself to steady them on the captain's chest. Her voice became razor-sharp, cutting through fear like a scalpel. "Listen to me," she said, tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to follow my instructions. I need you to stabilize us. Keep the plane level. Do you copy?" The co-pilot's eyes widened, but he nodded, barely audible. Jessica glanced at the blinking control panels. She'd never flown a plane, never even touched a yoke in real life. But she remembered simulator exercises from years ago, moments she had dismissed as irrelevant. "Adjust pitch slightly down, maintain speed, don't overcorrect," she instructed, words spilling out instinctively. She pressed down again on the captain's chest, counted compressions in perfect rhythm, blew a second breath, and leaned back to assess the instruments. Suddenly, the plane jolted sideways, thrown off balance by a sudden gust of wind. Jessica stumbled, nearly falling into the co-pilot's side, heart leaping into her throat. The cabin lights flickered, and somewhere behind her, a stewardess screamed. Passengers clutched armrests, crying, some attempting to stand, only to be pushed back by the sudden tilt. The aircraft felt alive, pulsing, struggling against the sky, and she realized that every second was a knife edge between survival and disaster. "Cabin secured," she shouted to the co-pilot. He nodded mutely, too focused on the controls. Jessica pivoted slightly, scanning the cockpit for anything that might help. She noticed a small oxygen tank, a portable emergency bag, a first aid kit. None of it mattered if the captain didn't survive. She could feel the pulse under her fingers fatting again. Desperation clawed at her throat. She couldn't let herself panic, couldn't let her fear dictate action. "Stay with me, Captain Reynolds," she murmured again. She had never spoken to him directly before, yet she felt a deep human connection, a shared thread of survival. She pressed down on the chest again, counting every beat, willing life back into his body. The co-pilot's voice cut through the tension. "We're losing altitude, 500 feet per minute, engine stable but unstable." His words were fragmented, trembling. Jessica's stomach twisted. "If we don't regain control, the ground will meet us far too soon." Her mind snapped into action. She leaned over the captain, scanning the instruments, guiding the co-pilot step by step. "Throttle up slightly, adjust rudder, autopilot can hold for a few more seconds." Each word was a lifeline, each instruction a tether connecting them to survival. Sweat streaked her face, her hair stuck to her forehead, but she didn't falter. The captain's pulse flickered once more, then steadied just slightly, a fragile thread of hope she clung to with all her being. Through the cockpit window, the clouds outside blurred past. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting eerie shadows across the instruments. Jessica's ears rang with adrenaline, her lungs burned with the effort of breaths she didn't realize she was holding. The passengers' murmurs from behind were a distant hum, irrelevant to the all-consuming urgency in front of her. Then a spark of hope. The captain coughed, a small, rasping sound barely audible but unmistakable. His lips tinged pink. Jessica froze, heart hammering in disbelief. The co-pilot blinked at her, eyes wide, as if realizing this might actually be happening. Relief surged for a split second, but the danger was far from over. The autopilot was failing, the plane still swaying with turbulence, and their altitude was dropping too fast. Jessica realized something terrifying. The next moments would require her to act not just as a nurse, but as a leader, a guide, maybe even a pilot. She swallowed hard, bracing herself for what she knew was coming. The plane was alive with danger, the captain barely clinging to consciousness, and hundreds of lives were balanced on her next move. The faint pulse under her fingers reminded her. Every second counted, and every mistake could be the last. And then a sudden lurch, stronger than before, tossed them both forward. The captain's body jolted violently, and Jessica's heart stopped for a fraction of a second. The plane jolted violently again, throwing Jessica against the co-pilot. She barely kept her balance, her fingers digging into the captain's shoulders as she pressed for a pulse. The faint flicker of life she'd felt moments ago seemed to weaken under the turbulence. Her chest burned, sweat stinging her eyes, hair plastered to her forehead. Outside, the sky was a swirling gray, a canvas of clouds whipped into anger by invisible winds. The horizon, once peaceful, was now a threat looming closer with every passing second. "Altitude dropping," the co-pilot shouted, voice cracking with panic. His fingers trembled on the controls, eyes wide as the instruments flashed warnings. "We're losing 300 feet per minute." Jessica's mind raced. She had stabilized patients in the ICU, on stretchers in the middle of code blues, but never a Boeing 737 hurtling through the sky with 180 lives depending on her ability to act. She pressed her lips together, forcing the panic down. Now was not the time for fear. Now was the time for action. "Listen to me," she barked, voice cutting through the chaos. "We're going to stabilize this plane, step by step. Follow my instructions and we survive." The co-pilot swallowed hard, nodding, a pale ghost of obedience against the storm of his own terror. Jessica leaned over the captain, fingers probing for life where it seemed barely present. His chest rose, then fell irregularly. Not enough, not yet. She pressed down, counted compressions, and tilted his head for rescue breaths, willing oxygen into his lungs. The faint flutter of a pulse mocked her relief. It was alive, but barely. "Throttle up 10%. Slightly nose down. Keep wings level," she shouted to the co-pilot, who fumbled with dials like a frightened child. The plane shuddered violently as turbulence slammed it from the side, and a loud clang echoed from the cabin. Jessica could feel the panic radiating through the cockpit. If they didn't correct the descent immediately, the plane could dip below safe altitude before the autopilot engaged again. Her mind raced through training and memory fragments from disaster simulations she'd reluctantly attended years ago. She remembered key phrases, emergency drills, adjust rudder, maintain airspeed, level wings before descent. Every word was life, every action a potential lifeline. She leaned into the co-pilot's side, pointing, guiding, commanding. Her voice became a razor, cutting through fear. "Cabin secured?" she asked quickly, scanning the small mirror for signs of chaos. A flight attendant's head popped into view through the small cockpit window. Her wide eyes mirrored Jessica's fear, but there was compliance. "All passengers seated, belts fastened," the attendant called, her voice cracking. Jessica nodded, grateful for the smallest sign of order in the storm. The turbulence intensified. The plane lurched again, throwing the captain forward slightly, his head tilting at a dangerous angle. Jessica grabbed him, supporting his weight while trying to keep his airway open. Each second was a balancing act between care and survival. Every breath she forced into him was a stolen moment against gravity and fate. "Come on, Captain, stay with me," she whispered, almost pleading. Her own hands were slick with sweat, shaking, but she forced them steady. The pulse was there, a faint, inconsistent thrum, but enough to tell her he hadn't given up yet. Behind her, the co-pilot's hands were shaking uncontrollably, fingers sliding off the yoke. Jessica's heart leapt. She couldn't just stabilize the captain, she had to stabilize the plane, too. "You need to focus," she barked, grabbing one of his hands and placing it firmly on the controls. "Follow my lead, we have this. Just listen to me." The plane dipped sharply to the left. Jessica's stomach lurched. Passengers in the cabin screamed, cups of soda spilled, a baby wailed. Turbulence had become a physical entity, battering the fuselage, rattling everyone's nerves. Jessica's lungs burned from exertion, but she refused to let go. The captain's pulse flickered again, barely perceptible. One wrong move and we're all gone. Jessica's mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Emergency landing, mountainous terrain. She didn't have time to calculate. They needed stability now, life-or-death stability. Her training, her instincts, and a steely determination fused into one guiding force. She pressed down for compressions again, rescue breaths, and whispered to the captain as if her words could pull him back. "You have to survive. We're not done yet." The co-pilot managed to adjust the throttle and Jessica barked, "Good. Nose down slightly. Yes, just like that. Keep the wings level." She could see him trembling, trying desperately to maintain control. The plane responded minimally, the slightest corrections preventing a catastrophic dip. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the cockpit. Jessica's heart jumped. She spun to see the overhead warning lights blinking furiously, an engine alert. The plane was holding, but barely. Her pulse matched the rapid beeping of the instruments. She pressed her palms on the captain again, willing his pulse to stabilize further. Passengers' reactions became louder now, a chorus of whispers, prayers, and cries from the back. She could feel their tension vibrating through the metal floorboards. She turned her head slightly, catching glimpses of the cabin, a sea of panic muted by her tunnel vision. It was all irrelevant. Her focus was singular. Stabilize the captain, stabilize the plane. Keep everyone alive. The co-pilot's voice was shaky but slightly steadier now. I can hold it for a few minutes," he said. Jessica exhaled sharply. Minutes weren't enough, but it was something. A foothold in the storm. She pressed down again, timing compressions with a flickering pulse. The captain's lips began to show a hint of pink. Relief surged, tempered immediately by the plane's instability. She glanced at the altimeter. Too low. The autopilot was failing. If they didn't regain altitude control soon, descent could become fatal. Her stomach knotted. "We need to prepare for manual corrections," she instructed. The co-pilot looked at her, panic returning. "Manual? No time, listen to me. Step by step. We adjust, we correct, we survive, trust me." Her voice left no room for hesitation. The co-pilot swallowed hard, nodding, hands gripping the yoke like his life depended on it, because it did. Jessica leaned over the captain again. His pulse was flickering, weak but alive. She continued compressions, alternating with rescue breaths. She murmured encouragement, almost talking him through recovery. "Come on, stay with me. We're not done yet." Suddenly, the plane lurched violently again, a gust of wind sending it into a slight roll. Jessica slammed her hand onto the yoke, holding it steady, while pressing down on the captain with her other hand. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned, sweat streamed down her face, but she refused to release her grip. Behind her, the co-pilot adjusted instruments, following her directions. Slowly, painstakingly, the plane stabilized enough to keep the descent from accelerating. Jessica's pulse hammered, but she noticed something miraculous. The captain coughed again, rasping but unmistakable. His lips turned pinker. His pulse flickered stronger. Life was returning, thread by thread. Her eyes met the co-pilot's. For the first time, a glimmer of hope shone back at her, but the danger was far from over. The plane was still vulnerable, still teetering in the sky. The turbulence raged outside, the engines threatened, and the altitude was marginal. Jessica's mind raced. They were alive, for now, but the fight was far from over. The next minutes would determine if they survived or if the sky would claim them all. Her hands returned to the captain, steadying, compressing, breathing, coaxing life back into him. Around them, the cockpit hummed with alarms and tension, a battleground between human skill, instinct, and fate. And then another sudden lurch, stronger than the last, threw Jessica forward, chest scraping against the controls, and the cockpit lights flickered violently. The plane tilted sharply to the right, sending a wave of terror through both the cockpit and the cabin below. Time slowed, hearts raced, and Jessica realized. The struggle for control had only just begun, and failure was no longer an option. The cockpit smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and the faint tang of recycled air. Jessica leaned over the captain, her hands trembling but precise, holding his chest steady as she forced another breath into his lungs. His pulse was weak, fluttering like a fragile bird trapped in a storm. Outside, the sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, clouds whipping past the windows as turbulence battered the plane like a living thing. The faint hum of engines had become a roar, warning lights blinking furiously across the cockpit, red symbols that screamed danger. Jessica exhaled sharply, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. She glanced at the co-pilot, whose wide, panicked eyes were glued to the controls. "We can't keep relying on the autopilot," she said firmly, voice cutting through the chaos. "It's failing. You're going to have to follow my lead. Step by step, okay?" The co-pilot nodded mutely, his fingers tightening on the yoke as though it were a lifeline. Her mind raced. She had no formal flight training beyond a few simulator exercises she had done years ago, more for curiosity than necessity. But now, with a nearly unconscious captain, a panicked co-pilot, and hundreds of lives depending on her, theory had to become practice. She scanned the cockpit, taking stock: throttle levers, yoke, rudder pedals, altimeter, airspeed indicators, navigation screens, all screaming urgent, precise instructions she had to interpret instantly. "Okay, stabilize wings first. Slight nose down to regain altitude. Keep the speed steady, don't overcorrect," she commanded, voice sharp. The co-pilot nodded, fumbling with the throttle as she directed him, correcting as the plane wobbled violently under another gust of turbulence. Every adjustment had to be exact. Too much and they'd nosedive. Too little and they'd lose precious altitude over the Rocky Mountains. She glanced back at the captain. His pulse had stabilized just enough to give her hope, but it was faint, almost imperceptible. Jessica gritted her teeth. "Come on, Reynolds, stay with me. I need you right now." Her hands pressed rhythmically against his chest, alternating with rescue breaths. The captain coughed again, a rasping sound that sent a wave of relief through her body, but she didn't allow herself to relax. One breath, one pulse, 1 second of inattention could cost lives. A sudden jolt threw Jessica's head forward against the control panel. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit, and a loud clang resonated from the cabin. She slammed her hand against the yoke, stabilizing it while simultaneously keeping pressure on the captain's chest. The co-pilot was frozen for a fraction too long, eyes wide, trembling. Jessica grabbed his hand, physically guiding him to follow her instructions. "Throttle up slightly, rudder right, wing level, now." The plane responded slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to prevent a catastrophic tilt. Jessica exhaled, sweat stinging her eyes. "Good, keep it there," she barked, forcing calm into her voice. The co-pilot nodded mutely, eyes wide, hanging on every word like a life preserver. She realized with cold clarity that she had become the leader here. Not just a nurse, not just a helper. She was the one making decisions that would keep hundreds alive. Her training in medical crises had prepared her for split-second judgment, but this was different. The stakes weren't just one life. They were all lives on this plane, hundreds of strangers trusting her to guide them through an invisible storm. "Cabin status," she barked, twisting slightly to peer at the small mirror above the cockpit door. The flight attendant's head popped in, hair damp with sweat, eyes wide. "Passengers, everyone seated and strapped," she called, voice shaking. Jessica nodded. Good, at least something is under control. Suddenly, another jolt. The plane lurched violently, tilting sideways. Jessica's stomach dropped as she pressed herself against the yoke, stabilizing the aircraft while simultaneously checking the captain's pulse. The weak flutter was still there, alive but barely. Her hands shook as she alternated compressions and rescue breaths, whispering, "Come on, stay with me, just a little longer." The co-pilot's voice trembled. We can't hold this altitude, not for long." Jessica's heart raced. Minutes weren't enough, they needed to regain proper flight control immediately. "Listen to me," she said sharply, leaning over him. "I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. Throttle slight increase, rudder slight left, wings level. Follow me." His hands moved, shaky but obedient. The plane responded, a small miracle in motion, though every bump from turbulence threatened to undo it. Jessica's mind mapped out every movement, every correction. She barked instructions, alternating between guiding the co-pilot and maintaining compressions on the captain. Every second was life or death. Through the small cockpit windows, gray clouds whipped past like a storm made tangible, the sun obscured behind rolling shadows. Jessica's ears rang with adrenaline, the cockpit alarms a constant reminder that time was running out. Sweat poured down her face, streaking the grime and stress of the past few hours. Every breath burned, every muscle screamed, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The faint pulse under her fingers was enough to give her hope, but the captain remained unconscious for the most part. His chest rose slightly under her hands, then fell erratically. She pressed down, whispering again, "Stay with me, we're not done yet." A sudden, violent turbulence ripped through the cabin, throwing the plane into a dangerous tilt. Jessica slammed her hand against the yoke, correcting immediately, while simultaneously forcing air into the captain's lungs. Her heart hammered in rhythm with the alarms, with every jolt of the plane, with every weak pulse beneath her fingertips. She realized she had no choice but to continue leading, directing, stabilizing. She had become the nerve center of the crisis. Every life depended on her. She could feel the weight of it, the crushing responsibility of hundreds of passengers, the helplessness in their eyes when they peeked at the cockpit. Then through the chaos, a sliver of hope. The captain's pulse strengthened slightly, and he let out a raspy cough, head jerking slightly as if fighting to return to consciousness. Jessica froze for a moment, feeling a surge of relief, but the plane was far from safe. Altitude still wavered dangerously, turbulence slammed unpredictably, and the co-pilot remained inexperienced, following her every command as if she were the only tether to survival. "Listen to me," Jessica said, voice unwavering, eyes sharp. "We stabilize him, we stabilize the plane, we survive, step by step together." The co-pilot nodded, following her instructions precisely now, fingers white-knuckled on the yoke. The plane responded more steadily, but every correction was fragile, every movement critical. The storm outside seemed to mock them, the gray clouds stretching endlessly, a reminder that there was no margin for error. Jessica leaned back over the captain, checking his pulse once more. Steady, just enough to keep fighting. Her hands moved rhythmically, compressions and breaths, whispering encouragement as though her words could coax him back to full life. Then another violent lurch. The plane tipped sharply to the right. Alarms blared. Jessica slammed her hands against the yoke and the captain simultaneously, stabilizing one while giving life to the other. The cockpit became a battlefield of human will against gravity, against nature, against time. Her chest burned, lungs ached, sweat poured down her face, but she refused to falter. She had become a beacon of control amidst chaos, the voice of authority for both the terrified co-pilot and the unconscious captain. And then the faintest glimmer of hope, a weak, rasping breath from the captain, a small but undeniable pulse, and the plane, for a brief second, responded to her guidance, less violently swaying than before. Jessica exhaled sharply, barely allowing herself to relax, one step closer but still miles from safe. She realized something terrifying and exhilarating. She was no longer just a nurse. She was the leader, the protector, the guide. She had become the fulcrum on which the balance between life and death rested. And in that fragile moment, as the plane leveled slightly, she knew the next few minutes would test her like never before. One wrong decision, one delayed breath, and everything could unravel. The fight for survival had only just begun. The cockpit was a war zone of sound, motion, and urgency. Warning lights flashed red across every panel, shrill alarms pierced the hum of the engines, and turbulence slammed the plane like a hammer on steel. Jessica leaned over the captain, her hands pressing rhythmically against his chest, alternating with rescue breaths. His pulse was fragile but steady enough to give her hope, yet each beat felt like a thin thread she could not afford to lose. She glanced at the co-pilot, whose knuckles were white from gripping the yoke. "Altitude is dropping," he gasped, voice trembling. Jessica's stomach twisted. They were over the Rocky Mountains. One wrong move, one miscalculated adjustment, and the descent would become fatal. Every second counted, every heartbeat a potential disaster. Jessica's mind raced. She had to act, and she had to act decisively. The autopilot was failing, the engines were strained, and the plane could not maintain altitude without immediate corrections. Her medical training had taught her how to stabilize fragile lives, but controlling a plane, that was uncharted territory. Yet she had no choice. Hundreds of lives depended on her ability to improvise, to lead, to make impossible decisions in the span of heartbeats. She leaned over the co-pilot, pointing at the dials and controls. "Throttle up slightly, 10%. Rudder right very carefully. Keep wings level. We need to maintain speed while gaining altitude. Do you copy?" The co-pilot nodded, eyes wide and shaking, but he obeyed. The plane responded, slightly at first, then more steadily. Jessica allowed herself a fraction of a breath, but she knew it wasn't enough. They were alive, yes, but only barely. Her hands returned to the captain. He coughed again, a raspy, life-affirming sound, but his eyes remained closed. Jessica forced herself to focus, alternating compressions with rescue breaths, whispering encouragement. "Come on, Reynolds, stay with me. We're not done yet." The plane lurched again, stronger this time. Turbulence ripped through the cabin, sending a shudder through the fuselage. Warning lights flashed furiously. A metallic bang echoed somewhere behind them, perhaps luggage shifted or a panel was struck. Passengers screamed, some clinging to loved ones, others frozen in terror. Jessica's pulse spiked in response, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She had to be calm, precisely decisive. She realized the terrifying truth. She might have to take control herself. The co-pilot was inexperienced and panicked. The captain was barely conscious. If the plane's descent continued, if altitude dropped further, no one else could manage this crisis. Jessica swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she touched the yoke. She had never flown a plane in real life, but she had simulated emergency scenarios years ago, had absorbed procedures in conferences she thought she'd never need. Now was the moment where all that distant, theoretical knowledge collided with deadly reality. Her fingers grazed the controls. The co-pilot looked at her, eyes wide. I don't know if I can," he stammered. "You can," she interrupted, voice firm and unwavering. "I'm guiding you. You follow my lead step by step. We're not giving up. Not now, not ever." The plane dipped sharply, forcing Jessica to brace herself. Her stomach lurched as she pressed firmly against the yoke, guiding the co-pilot's hands simultaneously. The captain's chest rose slightly under her fingers, pulse flickering but present. Hope clashed violently with fear inside her. One wrong adjustment, one slip of concentration, and everyone would die. "Check engine output," she barked, scanning the dials. Both engines were straining, humming in a discordant pitch. "We're holding, but barely. We need altitude now." The co-pilot's hands shook violently, but Jessica grabbed them, physically guiding his movements. "Throttle up gently, slight nose up, correct wings. Don't overdo it," the plane responded, slowly but surely. The turbulent air seemed to push against them, as though the storm itself wanted to punish their attempts at control. Jessica's thoughts flickered to the passengers. Hundreds of faces, hundreds of stories, hundreds of lives depending on her. She could hear the cries from the cabin, the soft sobs of children, the prayers of strangers. She forced herself to push aside the emotional weight. Focus was all that mattered. The lives below were tethered to her ability to act swiftly and decisively. Another shudder, another lurch. The plane dipped dangerously and Jessica's stomach sank. She could feel the pull of gravity against the fuselage. Her hands pressed down on the captain, forcing life into him while simultaneously guiding the plane's delicate movements. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she refused to relent. The co-pilot swallowed hard, voice quivering. I don't know if I can hold. Yes, you can, Jessica snapped. Trust me, step by step, throttle, rudder, wings, keep them level, we're going to survive. The captain's pulse strengthened slightly, as if responding to her insistence. He coughed again, weak but promising. Jessica's stomach eased slightly, but the plane was still dangerously low and the turbulence showed no sign of relenting. She needed a plan. Quickly, her mind mapped out their options. Emergency landing at the nearest airport was possible, but they were over mountains. Altitude needed to be regained immediately. She realized she might have to guide the co-pilot through maneuvers he had never performed, with only the faintest knowledge from simulations she had studied years ago. One wrong move, one delayed reaction, could send them spiraling. Her hands hovered over the yoke, ready to intervene directly if necessary. Sweat dripped down her face. The captain groaned faintly, a weak pained sound that reminded her why she couldn't give up. She forced herself to breathe steadily, calculating each micro-movement, throttle adjustments, wing corrections, altitude management. Listen to me, she barked. We're going to stabilize the plane. I need you to follow exactly what I say, step by step. Throttle up slightly, rudder right, small, very small, wings level. The co-pilot obeyed, trembling violently, but the plane responded. Slowly, minutely, they gained altitude. Jessica's hands never left the captain, alternating compressions with rescue breaths, whispering words of encouragement. The pulse, once a fragile flutter, became steadier. Life was returning, thread by thread. Outside, the clouds were roiling, gray and angry. The turbulence felt alive, like a force pushing against them, testing every ounce of control and skill. Jessica's eyes flicked to the instruments constantly, calculating, adjusting, guiding, leading. She realized she had become the fulcrum of survival, nurse, leader, guide, and co-pilot rolled into one. The plane responded better now, but not perfectly. Every correction was delicate. One overcorrection, one hesitation, one slip, and the descent could resume. Her hands burned from pressing on the captain's chest, lungs gasped for air, sweat streaked her face, yet she refused to let herself falter. A small sound drew her attention, the faintest cough from the captain. She froze, hope and fear colliding. His lips were tinged pink. He was alive, but still weak, still vulnerable. Jessica exhaled sharply. One small victory, but the battle was far from over. Altitude was still critical, turbulence relentless, engines strained. The co-pilot remained inexperienced, every motion guided by her hand and her voice. And then a sudden jolt, more violent than before, threw Jessica forward, chest scraping against the controls, the captain jolting with her and the plane tilting sharply. Every life on board teetered on a knife edge. One wrong move could spell disaster. Jessica pressed her palms to the yoke and the captain, her hands trembling, voice firm, mind sharp. The decision had been made. She would guide them through this. No hesitation, no second guessing. Lives depended on it and failure was not an option. She whispered to the captain again, "Stay with me. We're not done yet. You're coming back, I promise." The cockpit was alive with alarms, the co-pilot's trembling hands, and Jessica's determination. The fight for survival had reached a critical juncture, and every second was now a test of courage, skill, and human will. Jessica's arms trembled, sweat dripping into her eyes as she leaned over the captain, fingers pressing with precise rhythm against his chest. Each compression was a battle in itself, a fight to keep life in someone who had already begun to slip away. The faint flutter of his pulse, barely perceptible, was enough to give her hope, but the plane was still a living, breathing adversary. The turbulence outside slammed the fuselage violently, each gust forcing her to brace against the controls and the captain simultaneously. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. The co-pilot's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, his knuckles gleaming with sweat, his eyes wide with terror. "Altitude dropping, engine straining," he shouted. His voice wavered, but he obeyed her every instruction because there was no alternative. Jessica's pulse raced in perfect synchronization with the alarms, a frantic, urgent rhythm that seemed to echo the fragility of life itself. "Throttle up just a little," she commanded, voice sharp. "Rudder right, wings level, stabilize now." Her words were clipped precise, leaving no room for hesitation. The co-pilot adjusted, slowly, carefully. The plane responded, but each small correction felt like a battle against an invisible storm, the aircraft resisting like a wild beast. Her eyes flicked to the captain. He groaned faintly, his lips tinged pink now, but consciousness had yet to return. Jessica pressed for another breath, forcing air into his lungs, murmuring encouragement as if her words could coax life back into him. "Stay with me, stay awake, we're not done yet." The cockpit was a whirlwind of sound, motion, and tension. Every second felt stretched into an eternity, every movement critical. The plane lurched again, sharper this time, tilting violently to the left. Jessica slammed her hands against the yoke to steady the aircraft while pressing down on the captain's chest with the other. Her muscles burned, lungs screamed, sweat poured down her face, but she refused to falter. Every decision, every motion was amplified by the knowledge that hundreds of lives rested on her actions. "Cabin secure," she barked over the hum of alarms. Through the small cockpit mirror, she saw the flight attendant's head pop in, eyes wide, voice trembling. "Passengers are all seated and strapped in, ma'am." Jessica exhaled sharply. At least something was under control. At least some lives weren't in immediate jeopardy. The turbulence intensified. A sudden wave of wind slammed the plane to the right, throwing her forward. The captain's body jolted violently, and she caught him just in time, holding him steady against the yoke. The plane's wings rocked dangerously. Outside, clouds whipped past in gray streaks, lit intermittently by the dying sun. The aircraft shuddered as if protesting her attempts at control. "Hold on," she shouted to the co-pilot, who was now trembling violently, trying desperately to follow her instructions. "Throttle up slightly, rudder left, wings level, stabilize." He obeyed, shaking, sweat streaming down his face, but the plane responded, just barely. Jessica realized in a moment of stark clarity that she had become more than a nurse in this crisis. She was a leader. She was the fulcrum on which survival balanced. Her medical knowledge was keeping the captain alive. Her instincts and command were keeping the plane from crashing. The combination was precarious, but it worked, for now. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to breathe steadily. The captain coughed again, weak but audible, a thread of life she clung to desperately. His pulse was stronger, a fragile ember of hope, yet still inconsistent. Jessica's eyes darted to the altimeter and airspeed indicators. Altitude was stable for the moment, but the plane was still dangerously low, engines straining under the turbulent gusts. One mistake could undo everything. Then came another challenge. A loud bang echoed from somewhere in the cabin, followed by the distant clatter of falling luggage. Passengers screamed, some clutching each other, others frozen in terror. Jessica's stomach dropped. She couldn't afford distraction, not now. She pressed her palms against the captain and the controls simultaneously, forcing life into one while maintaining control of the other. The co-pilot's voice cracked. "I can't keep this, it's too much." Jessica's heart leapt, fear and urgency coiling in her chest. She grabbed his hands, steadying them on the yoke. "You can listen to me, step by step, follow my lead. We stabilize the plane, we stabilize the captain, we survive, understand?" He nodded shakily, swallowing hard, and followed her instructions. The plane responded, each micro-adjustment painstakingly executed under her direction. She pressed down for compressions again, forcing air into the captain's lungs, whispering encouragement as if life itself depended on her words. Hours could have passed in those minutes. The plane rocked violently, alarms screamed, the engine strained. Yet somehow, through sheer willpower, determination, and instinct, Jessica maintained control. The captain's pulse grew stronger, lips pinker, a faint groan escaping him. Life was returning, slowly but surely. Her eyes flicked to the co-pilot. He was pale, shaking, but obedient. He had become a vessel for her commands, a conduit for the precision required to keep the plane airborne. The passengers were secured, unaware of the full extent of the danger they were in, their lives suspended by the delicate balance of human skill, fear, and determination. Then the plane lurched again, turbulence worse than before. Jessica slammed her hands against the yoke to stabilize the aircraft while pressing on the captain's chest, simultaneously forcing a rescue breath. Her muscles burned, her lungs screamed, sweat stung her eyes, but she refused to release her grip. Every second was a test of endurance, courage, and human will. She realized she had no choice but to continue guiding both the captain and the co-pilot. She had become the nerve center of the cockpit, the voice of authority, the hands of life itself. Her mind calculated throttle adjustments, rudder corrections, and altitude management in real time, while simultaneously keeping the captain alive. Every heartbeat, every breath, every motion mattered. A faint cough from the captain brought a glimmer of hope. His lips were pink, pulse steadying. He was alive but still weak. Jessica pressed down rhythmically, whispering, "Stay awake, stay with me, we're not done yet." Suddenly, another violent lurch threw her forward. The yoke rattled beneath her hands and the captain jolted violently. She braced herself, pressing firmly on both the controls and his chest, whispering, "Hold on just a little longer." The plane responded minutely but enough to stabilize for the moment. Jessica's heart hammered, sweat poured, lungs burned, but she refused to relent. She had become the fulcrum of survival, the guiding force keeping hundreds alive. Through the small cockpit windows, gray clouds churned, whipping past like waves in a storm-tossed sea. The aircraft groaned under the strain, yet it held. The captain's pulse strengthened, life flickering like a candle in the wind, fragile but persistent. The co-pilot followed her every word, hands shaking violently, eyes wide with fear and awe. Jessica realized a terrifying truth. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a leader, a protector, a guide through chaos. Every action she took, every instruction she gave directly influenced the survival of hundreds. She had to remain precise, calm, and unwavering, or everything would collapse. And then a sudden, more violent lurch, the strongest yet, threw Jessica forward, chest scraping against the controls, and the captain jolted violently under her hands. The alarms blared, engines strained, and the plane tilted dangerously. Every life on board teetered on a knife edge. One wrong move could end it all. Jessica pressed her palms firmly against the yoke, and the captain, voice low but commanding, mind razor-sharp. She whispered to the captain again, "Stay with me. You're coming back. We're not done yet." The cockpit was alive with sound, motion, and human determination. The fight for survival had reached its climax, and every second counted like an eternity. The plane shuddered violently, throwing Jessica forward. Sweat streamed into her eyes, burning, blurring the instruments, but she refused to blink. Her hands gripped the yoke and pressed against the captain's chest, alternating between life-saving compressions and guidance for the co-pilot. Every heartbeat, every second was a battleground between life and death. The Rocky Mountains loomed outside the cockpit windows, dark, jagged silhouettes against a stormy sky. Below them there was no room for error. One miscalculation, one missed breath, 1 second of hesitation, and hundreds of lives would vanish. Jessica's voice cut through the alarms, low, commanding, unwavering. "Throttle up, rudder slight left, wings level, stabilize." The co-pilot obeyed, hands trembling, knuckles white. The plane responded minimally, each adjustment a fragile tether holding them in the air. The engine strained audibly, groaning under the load. Every panel in the cockpit blinked red, warning of impending danger. Jessica's pulse matched the frantic rhythm of the alarms, each thump a reminder that time was slipping. She glanced at the captain. He groaned faintly, weak but alive, lips tinged pink. His pulse had strengthened just enough to survive, but he was far from conscious. She pressed down again, whispering encouragement. "Stay with me, we're not done yet, hold on." The co-pilot's hands shook violently, but he followed her instructions to the letter. Jessica could feel the plane responding to their combined efforts, yet every small gain was precarious. The turbulence intensified, each gust like a hammer pounding on the fuselage. She could feel the aircraft fighting against her, as if nature itself resented their survival. A sudden alarm blared sharply. The left engine warning light flashed. Jessica's stomach dropped. If the engine failed completely, they could lose control entirely. She leaned over the co-pilot, voice steady despite the chaos. "Throttle up on the right engine, full power, rudder slight right, maintain wings level, adjust pitch slightly." He obeyed, fumbling but precise. The plane tilted, then stabilized enough to avoid a catastrophic nosedive. Jessica exhaled sharply, but there was no time to relax. The Rocky Mountains were closing in. They needed altitude immediately to clear the peaks, or the consequences would be catastrophic. Jessica's mind raced. She had never flown a plane in reality, never even touched a yoke outside of a simulator. Yet now she was making split-second decisions that would determine life or death for everyone on board. She realized she had become more than a nurse, more than a guide. She had become the fulcrum of survival, the lifeline for hundreds of strangers, and for the captain whose pulse she kept alive. "Co-pilot," she said firmly, voice cutting through the alarms, "we're going to climb, step by step. Throttle up smoothly, rudder left small, adjust pitch slightly. I need absolute focus." His fingers danced over the controls, shaking but obedient. The plane responded slowly, inching upward. The turbulence continued, throwing the aircraft violently, but Jessica's instructions kept them from tipping into disaster. She alternated compressions and rescue breaths on the captain, whispering words of encouragement. "Stay with me, just a little longer." A violent jolt threw her forward. Her forehead hit the dashboard, pain shot through her skull, but she didn't flinch. The co-pilot gritted his teeth, hands steadying at her guidance. The plane tilted sharply to the right, the wings dipping dangerously close to the mountains. Jessica slammed her hands against the yoke, correcting the tilt, and pressed on the captain's chest with the other. The pulse under her fingers was faint but alive. Below them the peaks loomed. Snow-capped and jagged, they rose like silent sentinels, waiting for any misstep. Jessica's mind calculated every maneuver, climb rate, airspeed, pitch, and throttle adjustments, all while keeping the captain alive and guiding the co-pilot. Her body burned with exertion, lungs screaming for air, sweat streaming down in rivers. "Altitude," she barked. "We're too low, we need more, push throttle, rudder right, wings level." The plane responded incrementally. The rocky terrain approached rapidly, but with each adjustment, Jessica felt a fragile hope take root. The captain coughed again, a weak, rasping sound, but life persisted in him. Her heart leapt, but she didn't allow herself to relax. They were still in mortal danger. Suddenly, a violent gust slammed the plane. It tilted sharply left, sending Jessica sprawling across the cockpit, her hands gripping both the yoke and the captain. Instruments flashed wildly. Passengers screamed faintly in the cabin. Every motion of the aircraft was magnified, each gust of wind a potential death sentence. Jessica forced herself upright. Her voice became razor-sharp, cutting through fear and alarms alike. Step by step, focus, throttle, rudder, pitch, wings level, stabilize. The co-pilot obeyed, shaking violently, hands moving precisely. The plane leveled, then climbed slowly, dangerously close to the rocky peaks. Her hands pressed again on the captain, alternating compressions with rescue breaths. Each pulse, each weak cough was a victory but fragile. Minutes passed like hours. The plane shuddered violently, the engines groaning under the strain. Jessica could feel the aircraft responding to their combined efforts, but it was exhausting, nerve-wracking, and terrifying. She alternated between guiding the co-pilot and saving the captain's life, every second a battle against the clock. Then she saw it, a break in the clouds, a patch of sky above the peaks. Light glimmered, a promise of survival if they could just hold it together. She took a deep, shuddering breath, voice calm but firm. Throttle up, climb, hold wings level, adjust pitch. The co-pilot followed her precisely, and the plane responded, slowly rising above the tree line. The rocky peaks flashed beneath them like jagged knives, but they cleared the worst of the terrain. Jessica pressed her hand against the captain's chest, feeling the pulse strengthen, lips turning pinker. Life was returning, thread by thread. Sweat stung her eyes, lungs burned, arms ached, but she refused to let go. She whispered again, "Stay awake, we're not done yet, you're coming back." The turbulence continued, less violent but still a threat. The co-pilot's hands shook, but he followed her instructions meticulously. Jessica adjusted throttle, pitch, and rudder continuously, stabilizing the plane while keeping the captain alive. She had become a living bridge between life and death, her body and mind the conduit for survival. A soft cough from the captain made her exhale sharply. He was waking, weak, unsteady, but alive. The relief was immense, but Jessica knew the fight was not over. The plane still had hundreds of miles to go, engines strained, turbulence unpredictable. And then the faint glow of distant lights, an airport runway, barely visible through the stormy clouds, appeared ahead. The moment of truth had arrived. Every decision, every breath, every heartbeat would determine whether they lived or died. Jessica's hands tightened on the controls, and the captain, mind razor-sharp, voice calm and commanding. "Prepare for landing, step by step. Focus. You follow my instructions. Together, we get everyone down safely." The co-pilot nodded, trembling, gripping the yoke like his life depended on it, because it did. The plane descended slowly, steadily, each micro-adjustment calculated precisely. Outside, the runway grew larger, clearer, a sliver of hope in the stormy chaos. Jessica pressed her hands to the captain's chest again, whispering encouragement. "You're okay, almost there. Hold on just a little longer." The plane leveled above the runway. Lights streaked past the windows. Engines groaned. Turbulence still buffeted them, but the aircraft responded to Jessica's guidance. She exhaled sharply, eyes stinging, heart pounding. They were so close. And then another jolt. One wrong move, one hesitation, one miscalculation could undo everything. Every life on board, every heartbeat hung by a fragile thread. The final descent had begun. The faint glow of the runway lights pierced the stormy clouds ahead, a beacon of hope in the chaos. Jessica's lungs burned, muscles screamed, and sweat stung her eyes, but she refused to blink. Every second mattered. Every decision was critical. Hundreds of lives depended on her ability to act, to guide, to command. The co-pilot's hands shook violently on the yoke, knuckles white, sweat dripping down his face. He followed her every instruction because there was no alternative. Failure was not an option. Jessica leaned over the captain, pressing rhythmically against his chest, alternating with rescue breaths. His pulse was steady now, lips tinged pink, weak groans escaping him as consciousness slowly returned. The faint cough he emitted was the most precious sound she had ever heard. Life was returning to him, but it was fragile, delicate, a candle in the storm. "Throttle up slightly," she barked, voice calm but commanding. "Rudder right, wings level, pitch slightly down, stabilize." The co-pilot obeyed, trembling, fingers gripping the yoke as though his life, and everyone else's, depended on it. Because it did. The plane responded incrementally, each small adjustment a victory against gravity, turbulence, and failing engines. Jessica pressed her lips together, forcing herself to breathe steadily. The plane had cleared the worst of the mountainous terrain, but the emergency was far from over. The storm raged, engines strained, and they were still hundreds of feet above the runway. One misstep, one delayed instruction, could spell disaster. Her eyes flicked to the captain. His pulse was stronger, but he was still weak, barely conscious. Jessica alternated compressions and rescue breaths, whispering softly, "Stay awake, you're coming back, just a little longer." Each beat of his heart was a victory, a promise that they might make it. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, turbulence slamming it from the side. Jessica slammed her hands against the yoke to stabilize the aircraft while pressing on the captain's chest with the other. The co-pilot's voice cracked. I can't hold it," he stammered, panic rising. "Yes, you can," she snapped, voice cutting through the storm. "Step by step, focus, throttle, rudder, pitch, wings, stabilize, follow me." The co-pilot obeyed, shaking, hands moving precisely under her guidance. Slowly, painstakingly, the plane leveled, inching closer to the runway. Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears as she alternated compressions and breaths, whispering encouragement to the captain. "Stay awake, almost there. Hold on." The runway grew larger, clearer, a narrow strip of salvation amidst the storm. Jessica guided the plane steadily, correcting every tilt, every pitch, every fluctuation caused by the turbulence. The engines groaned, warning lights flashed, but the aircraft responded inch by inch to their combined efforts. Jessica glanced at the co-pilot. Fear was etched on his face, but he trusted her completely, hanging on her every word. She realized the incredible responsibility she carried, not just for the captain, not just for herself, but for every passenger, every soul aboard this plane. She had become the fulcrum of survival. "Prepare for landing," she commanded, voice firm. "Throttle steady, wings level, reduce pitch, line up with runway." The plane descended slowly, dangerously close to the treetops and rocky outcrops. Jessica's heart hammered in sync with the alarms. Her hands ached from pressing on the captain, guiding the co-pilot and stabilizing the aircraft, but she refused to let go. Every second was a knife edge. One mistake could undo everything. Passengers in the cabin clung to their seats, eyes wide with fear. They had no idea what was happening in the cockpit, the full extent of the life-or-death battle unfolding above them. Jessica ignored them. Her world had narrowed to two people, one plane and one runway. The plane shook violently again, but she forced it into alignment. Throttle steady, pitch slightly up, wings level steady. She repeated the instructions over and over, her voice the only constant in the chaos. Slowly, the runway lights drew closer. The captain groaned faintly, weak but conscious. Jessica allowed herself a fleeting smile, but she didn't relax. The plane still had hundreds of feet to descend, engines strained, turbulence unpredictable. She alternated compressions and rescue breaths, whispering encouragement. "You're okay, we're coming in, almost there." The co-pilot followed her guidance perfectly, trembling but precise. The plane descended, the runway approaching fast, the ground rushing toward them. Jessica adjusted throttle, rudder, and pitch continuously, stabilizing the aircraft while keeping the captain alive. Her body ached, lungs burned, but she refused to relent. Then a sudden gust slammed the plane violently, tilting it dangerously. Jessica pressed against the yoke and the captain, whispering, "Hold on just a little longer." The co-pilot's hands shook, but he obeyed. Slowly, painstakingly, the aircraft leveled above the runway. "Throttle steady, pitch down, wings level, prepare to touch down," Jessica barked. The runway lights grew larger, closer, a sliver of salvation. The engines groaned under the strain, the alarms blared, but the plane obeyed. Inch by inch they descended, the ground rushing up. Jessica alternated compressions and breaths on the captain, whispering encouragement. "Almost there, stay awake, just a little longer." His pulse strengthened, lips pinker, weak groans escaping him. Life was returning. The plane's landing gear hit the tarmac with a shudder. Jessica's heart leapt, but she didn't relax. She guided the co-pilot's hands, ensuring the plane stayed on course. Tires skidded, brakes engaged, the aircraft groaned, but it slowed. Inch by inch, they decelerated until finally, with a final shudder, the plane rolled to a stop. The cockpit erupted in silence, then chaos. Jessica exhaled, collapsing slightly, hands still on the captain. The co-pilot shook, pale, tears streaking his face. Passengers erupted into applause, some crying, some hugging strangers, some kneeling in gratitude. The storm outside raged on, but inside the aircraft, a miracle had occurred. Jessica glanced at the captain. He was alive, his pulse steady, lips pink, eyes slowly opening. Weakly, he turned his head toward her, a look of incredulous gratitude in his eyes. "You saved us," he rasped. Jessica shook her head, exhausted but smiling. "We did it together. Everyone's safe." The cabin crew rushed to stabilize the passengers. Fire trucks and emergency responders began arriving on the tarmac. Jessica allowed herself a deep, shuddering breath. The storm outside had been terrifying, the turbulence relentless, the stakes unimaginable, but she had held on. She had guided the co-pilot, stabilized the captain, and landed the plane safely. Hundreds of lives were saved. She looked out at the stormy night sky, clouds swirling, wind still howling, and realized the enormity of what had just happened. She had faced death, chaos, and fear head-on and prevailed. Her hands ached, lungs burned, but she was alive. They were all alive. The captain coughed again, stronger this time, and managed a weak smile. I owe you my life," he said. Jessica shook her head, exhausted but determined. "We all did this, together, that's what counts." Emergency responders began assisting passengers, checking vital signs and guiding them to safety. Jessica allowed herself a moment to sit back, hands trembling, pulse racing. She had saved lives in ways she had never imagined. She had been a nurse, a guide, a leader, and a hero, all at once. Outside, the storm continued, indifferent to the miracle that had just unfolded. But inside the plane, in the cockpit and the cabin, a different reality existed. Life had won. Survival had prevailed. And one nurse, sitting with a weak but recovering captain, had rewritten the fate of everyone on board. For Jessica, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the overwhelming weight of exhaustion and relief. She had faced the unimaginable, acted decisively, and led through chaos. The passengers were safe, the captain alive, and the plane intact. She looked out at the storm, then at the co-pilot, then at the captain, and finally allowed herself to exhale fully. They had done it. Against all odds, against the storm, against death itself, they had survived. And for one unforgettable night, Jessica would forever be remembered as the nurse who turned terror into triumph, who took command mid-flight, saving hundreds, one impossible decision at a time.